everyone. Welcome to Cyber Smart Conversations with Harsha. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Bob Godin, Strategic Advisor at Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, CCTX, Canada's private sector organization for sharing the analysis of cyber threat information and enabling collaboration across all sectors. Bob has had a unique career in several Canadian security, intelligence, and law enforcement organizations. Thank you for joining me, and how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and thank you very much for having me, Harsha.
Thank you so much. Bob, one of the questions I always like to start with is to talk about the career journey. So share something about your career journey.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to do that. I probably had what's increasingly becoming commonplace within the cybersecurity world, and that is coming from a non-technical background. So a lot of my experience from the intelligence services has all been dealing with all the people that are doing the cyber attacks or attacks against Canadians. But I've tended, early in my career, to look at it from the human dimension of it. So that was the one side. And then the other side is I just like technology. I like to try to figure out what can technology do to either automate those things that I hate doing myself, or how can we actually use technology to advance what we're doing. And as the sort of my career within those two domains grew, I started to spend more and more time looking at how cyber attackers are coming at us through organizations. When I was at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or the Communication Security Establishment, sort of there we're worried about the attackers coming in, but at the same time defending the Canadian government. I then went to change a slight difference there from dealing with the attackers coming in to actually start looking at the strategic aspects of it. So I went to Public Safety Canada, and I was the architect for Canada's first cybersecurity strategy. And that was a lot of fun because that enabled me to spend a lot of time with the private sector across Canada, but also internationally, looking at what our allies are doing on cybersecurity and how can we be taking the best practices from around the world. But then it became time to say, okay, it's time I get out from the government and take a try at the private sector, and made the change over to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, and it's been great. Haven't regretted a single second of the whole thing. So it's been an interesting and fun career. And the thing is, you know, when I started out in this, I would never have thought about the kinds of technology that we're now doing. It actually didn't exist. And what will be fun, Harsha, is for you and I to sit down and do this in another year, another 30 years, and think about, wow, I wonder what the technology is that they're now doing today. I mean, that's what gets exciting about this.
Yes, Bob, I agree. And your passion for technology, human factor, and experience has helped shape the Canadian security industry.
Yep.
So today's topic is threat landscape in operational technology, OT. So, cybersecurity has always been a never-ending race, and we are seeing a rate of change is accelerating because headlines are there about reports of government agencies and large organizations, even the small one, being victimized by cyber intrusions. And this remains true even though there's a large increase in the global cybersecurity spending. Also, it's no longer limited to IT. The scope of the threat is growing and no sector is immune. And we are seeing an increase in cyber attacks in commercial real estate space. With, the Mirai botnet attack, the vulnerability of IoT devices was highlighted. The virus to infect over 600,000 of IoT devices. Most of them were video cameras that were installed in the building IT network, were being accessed using the factory default usernames and passwords. Now, simple endpoints attack, ransomware, and data breach, and the list is vast. So cyber attacks are getting far more advanced than ever before. So I would like to start your take on cybersecurity threat getting more and more advanced.
Harsha, you're absolutely right. The general consensus is that this threat that we're now facing is not going to diminish significantly in the near future. We're going to be stuck with this, and it's only going to increase. All the reports coming out, whether that be from the federal government's, from their cyber center, their threat assessment coming out from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, all of the reporting points to just more of the kinds of attacks that some of the examples that you actually provided. And it's interesting to look at this area or this problem that we've got from, I think, three perspectives. One is, who are the players? Like, who's actually doing the attacks? The second is, what's the implication or the impact of geopolitics? Because this is something that's newer into the game. And then the third part of it is, and you started to talk about that, is what are some of the advances in technology and what's that doing or how's that playing out in the field? So let me just give you a couple of examples of what's happening in that whole space. So first is from the players. I mean, the three biggest players involved in this are nation states. So we hear in the press, on an almost daily basis, what Russia's doing, what China's doing, North Korea and Iran. They're interested in stealing trade secrets or industrial secrets because they want to pass those along to increase their domestic capability. They want to pass that along. So basically their industries aren't having to do the research that we're having to do in Canada to do it. So that's continuing on. We're getting cyber criminals. You mentioned ransomware, that sort of thing. Cyber criminals are getting very good at doing it. They've made it into a business. This is now an art form for them. It comes with, they're setting this up almost the way you would a corporation, complete with service guarantees, varying types of capacity that they do. They trade the information amongst themselves. They're running this as a business. And their biggest objective in all this is getting money. How do they do that? And ransomware is the biggest attack. I think we're going to talk about that a little later on. But ransomware has basically made this a very profitable business. And unfortunately, the chances of them getting caught and prosecuted is pretty slight. So huge potential financial reward and limited cost. This is an easy decision for someone to be able to go through and do it. And a lot of the technology that they use, the attacks, they can download it from the web. They don't need to be technically proficient. Now, some of them do have some very good technical capabilities, but it's not all of them. Some of them can actually just sit back and download it from the web. So that's becoming a problem. And in some countries, they're able to operate with a little bit of immunity. So long as they're not attacking the host country. So for example, some of the Russian crime organizations operating in Russia, so long as they're not attacking Russian language speaking corporations or attacking companies in Russia, basically the government will leave them alone. Now, the government may come along at times and say, okay, criminal organization or criminal cyber attacker, you've got to do something for us, for the government, do an attack on our behalf, because that gives that government what we call plausible deniability. Yeah. They can get and say, hey, that wasn't us, that was some criminals going along, when in fact, it's criminals operating under their tacit approval. And then the second thing we're seeing is the activation of what we call hacktivists. And that's organizations that want to attack you because they're upset about some kind of a social activity or social norm that you violate. They're upset because you invested in something or you haven't done something. Now, what's interesting is all of this is starting to come together when we start to think about geopolitics. And the conflict that's occurring with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is probably the best example. So we're now getting cyber criminals that are taking sides on this. So they're conducting attacks on either side, depending on who they're in favor with. We've got hacktivists that are now acting on behalf of again, either organizations. And certainly you've got nation states trying to put pressure on governments to either drop their support for Ukraine, for example. So this whole geopolitics thing is now playing out. And now geopolitics has always been there. What's different now is this is playing out through the private sector, playing out through private networks. So now the private sector is becoming engrossed or becoming part of this web of international activity that's going on. The geopolitics is now affecting the private sector as they're going through. This is something brand new. We haven't seen that before. And then underlying all of that, the advances in technology, things like artificial intelligence as being able to increase the technical sophistication that the attackers can use coming in to launch their attack. So some of the phishing attacks using artificial intelligence are really convincing. It's really tough now to pick out that this is a phishing attack because they can make them look so realistic. So that's making it harder for the defenders to try and go through. Now, defenders are getting better at it too. We're starting to use artificial intelligence to process some of the attack techniques that are coming in. So we're getting better at doing it. But it's a little bit of that chicken and egg kind of thing. So as we both start to jump up the stream on it. And then the last part about that, and coming back to what you're talking about buildings, is the whole advent of the Internet of Things. So we're now putting a lot of devices and we're hooking them up to the internet. A lot of sensors that are now in buildings, and we can talk about that later, but a lot of the sensors in buildings are now all hooked up to the internet as a way to get back into the corporation so you can understand what's going on in your building. And everything you hook up to the internet is prospectively vulnerable to a cyber attack. So all those IoT things that are put out there are all subject to attack. And unfortunately, certainly in the first few years as we've been doing this, a lot of those IoT devices have very little, if any, cybersecurity built into it. Now, we're starting to see governments coming along and tell companies, look, you've got to be building cybersecurity in when you're designing these products. But right now, we've got a lot of devices out there that we're deploying all over the place, in the buildings, in our homes, that have very little cybersecurity built into it. So it's going to be an interesting space for the next few years. And I don't think any cyber defenders have got to be worried about being out of business certainly in the next few years.
Yes, and thank you, Bob, for sharing that. You know, the way you explain geopolitics, because mitigating the risk is one thing, but it's also important to understand who is doing that, why they are doing that, from where it is originating, to have all that perspective in place. And you mentioned about commercial real estate and artificial intelligence and devices. So as buildings are getting smarter with smart devices and traditional building systems are, gradually moving to the cloud, it increases the cyber risk. So we have seen hackers gaining access to building systems through Wi-Fi, other ways, and it hugely impacts tenant safety and equipment safety. So what do you think are the greatest risks to the buildings at the moment?
I think at its simplest is the notion that if it's smart and you've connected it to the internet, then that becomes a possible entry point for the cyber attacker getting into the system. And what happens is, when we start to deploy these devices, they're doing great things and making it much better at determining the operational efficiency of the building, how the building is run, everything from the water, the lighting, the air circulation. All those things are excellent at making the buildings much more habitable and much more valuable and useful space for tenants, quite frankly. But it becomes at a risk as we're starting to do it. Some of the older operational technology that we actually deployed, some of that is so old you can't put cybersecurity, the new cybersecurity tools on it. It was never designed. They were put in place before the internet was actually something we would be using in buildings. So it's really difficult to go back and retrofit some of those things. And we're starting to see the attackers have figured out there's a new attack technique they're actually calling siegeware. And what they want to do is go in through some of those devices that have been deployed, and they want to take control of it. So they want to get into some of the smart meters, into the HVAC system, some of the lighting systems, or the security systems. Because if they can get control of that, they can actually, at some point, or get control of the elevator, they can actually prevent employees from either getting into or getting out of a building, or your tenants into or out of a building, or in a shopping mall, to really destroy that customer experience. And what they want to do is try to put pressure on the building owner or the management firm to pay the ransom. Because until you pay the ransom, we're not going to release all those doors that we've now locked down, so customers, tenants can get in or out of the building. And that puts a lot of pressure on building owners as they go through with that. And so I'm talking about the building itself, but corporations also hold a lot of data, a lot of valuable information. Like, they've got employee information, they've got customer information, they've got a lot of information about their tenants. They've got a lot of data about how the building actually operates. So some of that material that makes them a competitive, come to my building as opposed to the building down the street, because I can do it more competitively. They hold all that data. So some of those access points that we were talking about when they deployed the Internet of Things devices, the sensors, is a way for the attacker to actually get back into the corporate records, because all those sensors are hooked up into the corporation's IT section. So if you can get back into the IT section, be looking at it, you get access to all that data, and then you run the risk of losing the data or not being able to get access to it if it's a ransomware attack. And the other concern, and we're just starting to see that now, is, so I've been talking about how the building owner or the building management team wants to secure the building for their own purposes and what the reason that they've got the building up and running. But there's another player in this, and that's the tenant. And so all of a sudden, if you've got unsecured building that you're running, and your tenant has to hook into your building because they need to get access to doors or alarms or gates, entry gates to some part of the building, you then become, as a building owner, become an access point to your tenant. And now all of a sudden, your tenant has now become a potential victim of a cyber attack not because the attack came in against them initially, but it's because the attack came in against the building that they're in. So we're now starting to see tenants starting to go back to their landlord and say, hey, look, how secure is the building you're asking me to go into? And do we start to put that into some kind of an agreement on the tenant lease agreement, something in there about cybersecurity? And that can go the other way around. So I was just talking about sort of the tenant being the victim, but it can happen the other way. So the landlord's got to be starting to think about, okay, this tenant that I'm just putting into this building, they're going to hook up into the part of my building. And if that tenant gets attacked, is there a risk that that attack could migrate into my corporate side of things and ultimately affect not just the tenant, but to my corporate records, but more importantly for some will be to affect the entire building. So this is starting to become a new paradigm where we've got to actually start to think about partnerships in cybersecurity between all the people when you start that are looking at buildings, office accommodation, for example. It's not just a problem for the landlord, it's not just a problem for a tenant, it's a problem for both of them. So how do we get those two groups sitting down together and talking about how do we make the entire infrastructure cyber resilient so nobody becomes reduces the likelihood of somebody will become a victim, and if they are, they can bring the entire system back up and operational as fast as possible.
Yeah. Bob, you made an interesting point with tenants bringing their own systems and hooking to the base building systems. And if they get attacked, it cascades to the property, to the buildings. And the same thing, vendors bringing their own system are managing and controlling the building systems. And if they get attacked, it cascades to the building. Because, at KTech Labs, when we do the cybersecurity assessment, we have seen so many such cases where vendors manage the whole system. They are the one doing the remote access. And, if they get attacked, it cascades to the building. And at the end, it's the building tenants, building reputation, and everything comes to stake. Because based on the assessment we have done, we see devices exposed to the internet, and especially building automation system for the purpose of providing remote access to these vendors. Use of removable media by the vendor for backups. And we have seen, like you mentioned, increase in the ransomware attack and remote access control gained over the building equipment. So what's the best way to deal with ransomware attack? And this is, a very debatable topic, to pay or not to pay.
Oh, yeah, that's a big question, and sometimes not an easy answer. And part of it starts off with you've actually got to have this conversation in the company before an attack occurs. When attack occurs, everybody goes into panic mode, and that's a lousy time to be starting to sort out all of the ins and outs of dealing with a ransomware payment. So the first thing is sort of have that conversation long before it starts. The decision sort of when it comes down to should you pay or not pay, it's governed by a few things. First of all, it's not generally illegal to make a ransomware payment in Canada. You can do that. The only exception comes as if the entity you're making the payment to is on one of the sanctioned organizations, or you're a terrorist organizations. That will be illegal. But other than being on a sanctions list or terrorist organization, generally saying it's legal to do that. You then get into the philosophical question over should you pay or shouldn't you pay? And there's a couple of things coming out of that. One is when you're the victim, you're worried about bringing your system back online as quickly as possible. So one of the things you've got to be thinking about is what's the business impact or the impact to my operational capability as a result of this ransomware attack. So you've got to be thinking about that sort of thing. What's the reputation that you've got, or how long can you afford to have your business not operating? In some businesses, the attackers are trying to go after you to put pressure because they know you've got to get back in business right away. Some other companies, depending what the data is that's lost or they can't get access to, they may be able to go for a week or two. And if you can go for a week or two, then maybe you can try and deal with the attack without having to pay it. If you're in a business, like if you're running a hospital or a critical infrastructure, you can't afford to be down for much more than probably a few hours, maybe not even that long. So the pressure mounts within the corporation to make the payment. And so you'll want to have thought through in advance, if you're going to have to make that a payment, you think out in advance with the board, with your executives, what are the conditions under which you would make a payment? And then if you're going to do that, how would you do that? One of the considerations you're going to want to be thinking about is, what does my insurance company say? Do they have any provisions in there that say they will or won't pay for a ransomware? Should that occur? And what are the conditions under which they'll do that? So again, you want to sort that out ahead of time before the process starts. You're also going to want to think about, what happens if I make the payment and the attackers don't decrypt the data? Not all the attackers have got the ability to actually decrypt the data the way they tell you they're going to do it. And sometimes the decryption tools that they give you actually don't work that well. We've seen examples of where that's happened, where both some companies have paid and they never hear from the attackers again, and then they're still left on their own. We've had other examples where they've gone through, made the payment, the attackers give them the decryption tool, but the tool is so lousy, it takes so long to decrypt it, the company's got to go back and try and find alternative things to do. It was interesting, about a year and a half ago, I guess, CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, did a survey. And one of the things that they found was almost 2/3 of the cybersecurity professionals that participated in the survey, they were trying to convince the government, or wanted the government to actually outlaw or make it illegal to make ransomware payments. Because one of the concerns is, the attackers do this because they know it's profitable. And if all of a sudden they started to find out that companies aren't willing to pay, they're going to stop doing it. So the more we pay the attackers, the more there's an incentive for them to do another attack, to come in after someone else. And the other thing that's really troublesome, and I haven't got a good statistic on it, but we're seeing anecdotal evidence of it, is that companies that make the ransomware payment are victimized again. Because the attackers know, if I come after you, you're going to pay. And so they'll come back at you a second time or a third time. So it's a tough decision. If you're a company that's struggling with being out of business, you've got customers that you can't be supporting in the way you are, you've got employees that are anxious, you've got shareholders that are concerned about value, there's a huge incentive to want to make the payment. And that's where companies have got to sit down and sort of make some of those decisions, as many as you can, ahead of time. And if nothing else, outline a process by which you're going to go through. And, here's the itemized list of things I need to be thinking about when that ransomware payment comes in, so you're ready. So everyone knows their role, from the CEO, the board, all the way down through the organization. What does everyone have to do? Because once you get into that mode, it isn't just the IT shop that becomes involved. It's the human resources department looking after the personnel and the implication for them. It's your communications teams that are worried about, how are you getting messages out to the public, to your shareholders, to your suppliers, to your customers. It's your legal team in terms of helping to protect the corporate data and doing whatever interaction. So this is when an incident occurs, this isn't just a problem for the IT. This is a whole of business approach. And again, back to the planning, you want everybody to have thought in advance of the attack, what is my role going to be when this incident's happened? And then you're as prepared as you can be to deal with that unfortunate day when you see that black screen that comes up and says, you are now a victim.
Interesting. And this all ties to addressing the human factor and development of a cybersecurity culture in the organization. Because people used to always be seen as a vulnerability. And now comes the technology part of it. So how to establish a security culture?
You're absolutely right. We did have this perception that, if we could just solve the people problem, this would all go away. But when you think about cybersecurity, it's 3 pillars. It's technology, it's policy and procedures, and it's people. And if you're not dealing with all 3 of those, the attacker is just going to decide, okay, you blocked up that one, I'm going to come in through one of those other 2 doors, because the attacker doesn't care. They will come through it. And quite often, people should be considered as your first line of defense. So when all the technology fails and everything else isn't working, they're the ones that you can rely on to do something about it, to stop it, to think about it. And that requires things like informing them as to what their responsibility is, what's their role, how can they be an important part of this, so they get empowered by being part of this process, and they can see the benefits of the corporation to their job on being part of that. So it comes with a training and awareness. And it's not the, do the one test and you're done forever. This is an ongoing thing you've got to be doing to as new techniques or attackers' techniques come in. You want to be refreshing, how you're informing your employees how they can participate in that process. And it creates you need to create a culture of that. And that culture comes from the senior leadership within the organization, that they reach down and they empower the employees to say, look, you're a critical part of our cyber defenses. The IT department will be there helping, but you're a critical part of that. And so that tone, that culture that's set by the CEO, by the board, by the executive leadership is critical in making your employees part of that first line of cyber defense. And one of the small things that goes along with that is, and we've all done these exercises where you go through and you might click on something, or occasionally you'll click on it and you'll contact the IT department. You always want to compliment people on doing that. You never want to do something like say, oh, wow, why would you ever do that? Because eventually what will happen is people won't tell you that they think they might have clicked on something in error. And that attack that might have actually come in, if they tell you right away, you might have a chance to do something about it. But if your employees are afraid that they're somehow going to be chastised or penalized if they tell you about it, that attack is going to have an opportunity to spread throughout the organization. So that opportunity you've got of diminishing the impact within your organization starts to go out the window. So again, it's back to that beginning. Empower your employees to make them part of that first line of defense within your organization.
Yes, and it's about fostering a culture of cybersecurity awareness, because as cyber threats and mitigation strategies are rapidly evolving, it's really important to engage these stakeholders and educate them, because the goal is to build a culture of cybersecurity. So thank you, Bob. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's an honor to have you on my podcast. I'm very sure our listeners will be benefited by your experience.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on, Ashley.
Thank you.